Hello, learners, and welcome to the 33rd lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous two lectures, I have introduced the figure of W.H. Auden. I have described the cultural and intellectual contexts in which Auden began writing his poetry and the differences between Auden and other famous, well-known names, specifically one well-known poet, T.S. Eliot. W.H. Auden is among the more popular poets of the 20th century and has written a few poems which can be counted as among the handful of poems which define the 20th century. Hopefully, we will get time to go over some of these iconic poems. In the previous lecture, I have indicated that one such iconic poem is In Memory of W.B. Yeats. I read the first stanza and in fact also the first section of this poem, and I briefly introduced some of the thematic and stylistic aspects of this poem. I will return to a reading of this poem, provide a detailed study of this poem, but before I do that, I will provide some background context to W.H. Auden, the personality of W.H. Auden, the literary tradition in which he was writing, and the differences and dialogue that Auden undertook between himself and other poets. So the first thing to note when we speak of Auden's place in the tradition of English poetry, we must note that Auden was a very well-read poet, and Auden situated himself very carefully at the intersection of multiple genealogies. I have described Auden's immersion in the tradition that T.S. Eliot introduced. I have described how integral T.S. Eliot's personality and career was to the origin of W.H. Auden's career as a poet. It was the editorial approval of T.S. Eliot as well as the intellectual inspiration of Eliot which inspired Auden to begin writing and to begin to get published as a poet. Two other poets are also important for understanding Auden's rise and development that Auden's poetry underwent. The first of these poets is Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen is a very, very popular poet of the 20th century, poles apart from the kind of serious, erudite and cerebral poetry that one associates with T.S. Eliot. A very important aspect of Wilfred Owen's poetic style was the way Owen's poems inspired and aroused the emotions and the feelings of readers. Wilfred Owen, along with Siegfried Sassoon, is famously known as a war poet. There were others, but Sassoon and Owen have cemented their place in the canon of 20th century writing as war poets. They wrote poems about the First World War, about the suffering, about the unimaginable carnage, mutilation, dismemberment, and just both the physical as well as the intellectual consequences of industrial warfare. This was Wilfred Owen, and a sentence that Owen spoke, which is frequently used to define his style as well as his inspiration, is that the poetry is in the pity. It's worthwhile taking a moment to interpret the sentence and to try and place its connections to Auden's poetry. Poetry and pity are placed in a particular relationship. In Owen's view, pity is what makes poetry powerful. Pity is what gives poetry its power to communicate human universal truths to its readers. In saying so, in placing pity uh, in such an integral, constitutive relationship to poetry, Owen was going against some ideas that were popular in the intellectual and cultural milieu of the time. One very, very direct uh, competitor or rival to this kind of thought can be found in an essay that we have discussed a few lectures ago in this course. That is the essay titled Tradition and the Individual Talent by T.S. Eliot. Attentive learners will recall how in that essay, T.S. Eliot describes the poet's mission as not the expression or turning loose of emotion, but rather an escape from emotion. T.S. Eliot's worldview places poetry and pity in a diametrically opposite relationship. For T.S. Eliot, a poet can become successful as a poet if he or she can remove the pity from the poetry. In fact, the task of poetry is to transform emotions which otherwise might have aroused pity into objective correlatives, into words and images which change the emotion into an image. The image takes the place of emotion, and it is in the task of decoding the emotion from the image that readers derive joy from poetry, as poetry was conceived by a poet like T.S. Eliot. So this is the difference. For Wilfred Owen, there was no such complicated or erudite decoding that was required. The poetry was a direct expression of pity. Readers must be hit, almost shocked or jolted into these powerful feelings of pity. In this sense, Owen is also very close to the Aristotelian theory of drama, in which catharsis is a very important part, the purging of emotions. It is in feeling pity for the character on the stage and feeling violent pity and horror for this character on stage that the audience of a play derives a very unique, sublime form of pleasure. In a similar way, Owen wanted to give readers who had never been to war, who had no idea of the kind of suffering that industrial warfare could unleash, such readers to experience, to learn about this kind of unimaginable suffering. And once they got a sense of the suffering, for them to know that there were human beings on this earth like themselves, who while the readers were sitting in the comfort of their warm homes, there were other human beings on the battlefields of Europe in World War I who were undergoing unspeakable suffering. The difference between the comfort and the suffering should arouse powerful feelings of pity. This was the goal of poetry as Wilfred Owen imagined it. Now, this was a position, the poetry is in the pity. This was a position that was very inspiring for W.H. Auden. This sentence was frequently quoted, printed, anthologized, and given a very important place in the group of poets that Auden had created during his time at Oxford University. Now, in contrast to this, in contrast to Wilfred Owen's position on the importance of pity, there was another position which was slightly more ironic, and this was the position taken by William Butler Yeats. William Butler Yeats, as I have discussed, was among the writers who defined the 20th century. And Yeats was a towering influence on all poets in the 20th century. W.H. Auden himself had a somewhat complicated relationship to Yeats. And in the context of writing poems about people who had suffered, in a way, Owen's war poems were like elegies, but they tried to raise the consciousness amongst civilians how war was such an unjust, depraved, and corrupt phenomena. Similarly, Yeats also wrote poems about the suffering of other people. But Yeats's own style was very different because in Yeats's elegies, the poet very consciously kept the feelings separate from the words. Yeats's elegies were less about the feelings of loss or the person who was lost. In fact, they were more about the poet himself. These were poems of self-definition. And Auden's own relationship to Yeats was very complicated, first and foremost because these two poets shared very different political worldviews. I have described the sharp difference between W.H. Auden and T.S. Eliot. While describing the political differences between Auden's socialism and Eliot's conservatism, I mentioned how Eliot is part of an almost unholy trinity of canonical 20th century poets who had a very conservative position with regard to politics. Among this unholy trinity, Eliot was one, but there were others, and Yeats was a very important part of this trinity, as was Ezra Pound. Why was Yeats, or why is Yeats considered a part of this trinity in which powerful poetic achievement is linked to conservative politics? This is because Yeats remained indifferent to the cause of Irish nationalism throughout his career as a poet. Yeats lived through times in which there was a great deal of political ferment, in which a lot of contemporaries of Yeats were directly involved in the Irish struggle for independence against Great Britain. This was a time when writers and intellectuals lent their words to the cause of Irish autonomy and political independence. This was also a time when other individuals contributed not just their words or thoughts, but their lives and their bodies in acts of physical confrontation and violence. Despite living in such times, Yeats remained extremely indifferent and did not really consider the Irish struggle for independence to be an important part of his mission or his task as a poet. This was a major point of difference, and this will be glossed over briefly in Auden's famous poem, the elegy titled In Memory of W.B. Yeats. Yeats and Owen were both writers who influenced Auden very powerfully. Auden sits at a unique midpoint between these two positions. Auden works with a lot of pity, but also works in some detachment from the subject of his elegy. Key to Auden's style is something that scholars have called an imitative or mimetic aesthetic. This mimetic aesthetic involves Auden using aspects of the subject's own writing style in order to write a poem about this subject. So in Auden's elegies for poets such as Hardy or writers such as W.B. Yeats or scholars such as Sigmund Freud, Auden writes in a way that incorporates some of these writers' own writing styles and intellectual approaches to their subjects. Another very important aspect of difference between Auden and Yeats was the kind of attitude their poetic personae appropriated with regard to their subjects. And some of these differences can be understood by examining the differences between the sexual orientation of these individuals. Yeats, like many other male poets, was frequently in an Oedipal relationship to the tradition of literary history. When I say an Oedipal relationship to literary history, I'm using the thesis of the recently expired scholar Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom famously wrote about The Anxiety of Influence, a book which gave a literary history of English poetry, understood through the kind of relationship of rivalry and competition in which several English poets viewed themselves. Starting with Milton and the Romantic era poets William Blake, Bloom studies poetry in a series of chain reactions in which several poets examine the relationship that their own writing has to that of a tradition of writing poetry. These are relationships which have a lot of rivalry. Poets try to motivate themselves and set before themselves a task of continuing and also going further from the work of poets who have published before them. Yeats often sees himself or places himself in an Oedipal relationship to other poets about whom he writes elegies. In addition to this Oedipal relationship to the tradition, Yeats also betrays what can be called a homosocial anxiety about intimacy between the male poet and the male subjects of elegies. What is this homosocial anxiety, and how can it better help us understand the way Yeats writes his poems? A homosocial anxiety is an anxiety in which the writer fears that a friendship or an intimacy or a relationship of camaraderie or that of wishing someone well, if such a relationship exists between two men, then there is a fear that it may be understood as a veil or a kind of shadow or a kind of disguise for a homosexual relationship. This was a fear that hounded several writers in the 19th century as well as the early 20th century. This phrase, the homosocial anxiety, was inspired by and first theorized by the scholar of queer studies, Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. And Sedgwick, in fact, wrote a literary history of English literature titled titled Between Men. In this book, Sedgwick argues that the history of English literature can be understood as a history of trying to hide what were, in fact, homosexual tendencies. But because of the repression, because bourgeois normal societies were heteronormative, it was not possible to reveal, or it was not possible to come clean with a degree of honesty about these homosexual tendencies or relationships. Therefore, a lot of writing which describes the relationship between men as rivalries, either healthy rivalries of between friends or unhealthy rivalries and relationships of violence. Both of these can be understood as homosexual veils or disguises. And a similar fear can be found in the writings of W.B. Yeats as well. Yeats was an aristocrat. Yeats came from a very privileged background, from family that owned significant amounts of property. And Yeats was very suspicious of liberal or radical changes or thoughts that seem to, or that encourage people to think about their identities, including religious, but also sexual and gendered identities in new ways. So, being such a conservative when it came to human identity, it was natural that Yeats would be quite suspicious of a lot of homosocial anxiety, and in fact was very anxious to not appear to be trafficking in any such discourse. So probably it was this anxiety of this desire to not appear to be a certain kind of person that ensures that when Yeats writes elegies, and if the subject of these elegies happened to be male, there was an aspect of distance and detachment in these elegies. Now, in Auden's writings, we find the very opposite of this. Not only is there no detachment, there is a degree of affectionate self-surrender in Auden's writing about male subjects, and especially Auden's elegies about male subjects. Auden also imitates these male subjects. So the difference then between Yeats's elegies and Auden's elegies is that while Yeats cultivates a studied, intellectual and cultured distance between the poetic speaker, between the narrator or the speaker of the poem and the subject, Auden displays a very affectionate degree of imitation. Imitation that comes from a desire to learn from a more accomplished writer. It also comes from a desire to pay respect to the tradition of writing that has been published before his own writing. And it also comes from a religious place, that Auden's religiosity and his piety, which meant that as a believer, Auden believed in sacrificing his own ego, his own individuality, at the altar of a higher ideal. So for all these reasons, Auden's writing about other subjects, other people who've passed away, has an affectionate quality, and it also has a very powerful aspect of Auden imitating the writing styles of other writers. So Auden's way of memorializing the deaths of other writers is to produce poems about their lives, which are also written in the style that was created by these writers. Now, before we return to the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats, there are certain texts and certain ideas and certain words that we need to understand, which will help us appreciate the kind of person that Auden was and what kind of an intellectual inquiry he was engaged in at the time that he published this poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats. The first of these texts that Auden wrote is a prose piece published in the year 1939. This is the same year that the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats was published. It also happens to be the year that W.B. Yeats actually passed away. So after Yeats passes away, Auden writes this essay titled The Public versus the Late Mr. William Butler Yeats. The very title of this poem indicates what the piece will be. It's an essay that takes stock of the life and work of a poet who has recently passed away. But this essay is not structured as a straightforward recollection. It is not structured as a straightforward memoir or history. In fact, it is structured in the form of a public trial. There is a case in a court, and two parties are arguing for different sides, opposing sides. They are debating. What are these sides? And both of these sides have to do with the cumulative final assessment and reputation, as well as the legacy of William Butler Yeats. It seems to people that the poet who has just passed away, that is Yeats, has had a complicated legacy. There are some things that Yeats said, wrote, believed in, and did, which are considered regressive, and for certain people, not worth remembering, not worth preserving, and definitely not worth emulating. This is one sense. However, there's also another sense, and this is the opposite view, that Yeats was in fact a very, very powerful poet. Despite his beliefs, despite his actions, despite his conservatism, there was something quite powerful and almost magical about the way this person, Yeats, used words and the kinds of poems he created. So this is the trial between these two opposing positions, and Auden uses the death of Yeats as an opportunity to try out some of his own thoughts in public. And Auden believed that he was the right person to try out these thoughts because Auden himself had strong opinions on both sides of this question. That is, Auden believed that Yeats had made some mistakes when it came to his beliefs about politics, his beliefs about nationality, his beliefs about gender, and so on. But at the same time, as a poet, Auden also believed that despite Yeats's problematic politics, he did something which was quite unprecedented. He gave English poetry a great and a wonderful gift, the gift of his words. No one else was as accomplished as Yeats, and no one else could produce the unique music that Yeats's poems produced. These poems, the music of these words, were enough to justify forgetting, neglecting, and discarding all of the bad things that Yeats might have done as a politician or as a person or simply in any of his other roles other than that of writing poems. So this is the first essay. This is published in the year 1939. In this essay, Auden writes that Yeats's poems for other people must be interpreted in a particular way. They must be interpreted as attempts to counter something that Auden calls is the atomization of life in the 20th century. By atomization, Auden means that people are isolated. Society is becoming more and more fragmented. Individuals are finding it harder and harder to connect to each other. This was what Auden meant by atomization. And Yeats had begun to notice this and had tried to challenge this tendency towards atomization through his poems. We will discuss the other works of Auden, the other prose pieces by Auden that help set up his poem in memory of W.B. Yeats in the next lecture. Thank you.